Hello and welcome to the course Introduction to Brain and Behavior. I am Dr. Ark Verma from IIT Kanpur. This is the seventh week of the course and I'll be talking to you about neuroscience of language comprehension. The first step in understanding or comprehending language, irrespective of modality, whether you're listening to the language or you're reading the language, let's say in form of a book or something, needs to be the perceptual analysis of the linguistic input. It seems that the brain uses the same mechanisms to understand spoken language and written language. However, there might be some key differences between the two modalities. For example, when individuals attempt to understand spoken words, the listener needs to decode the acoustic input, which is basically the input in the sound format. The result of this analysis is then converted into a phonological code, and the lexical representations of the auditory word forms stored in the mental lexicon will now be accessed. So, the idea is whenever you're listening to something being said, what you do is you basically try and convert whatever you're hearing into a sort of a phonological code, which is basically a combination of phonemes that have found these words. Once you have activated this, basically what you do is that you take this particular code and you match it with a similar code or a matching code which is already present in your auditory mental lexicon, let us say. Okay, so as in the last lecture I said that the mental lexicon could be same for both modalities or it could be different. So let us say if there is in the mental lexicon, whether it is the same lexicon for both or a different auditory mental lexicon, this mental lexicon will also have these words stored in this sort of a phonological code. So what happens is when you listen to some language, basically you try and decode it in terms of this phonological code, you analyze it in terms of this phonological code, and whatever the phonological code of input is matched with the already stored phonological code of the word form in your mental lexicon. What you will do now is you will try and match these two things, which is basically the process of lexical access that we talked about. Okay, so the lexical representations of the auditory word forms stored in the mental lexicon can now therefore be accessed. Further, after this acoustic input will get translated into the phonological format as I just described, the lexical representations in the mental lexicon that match the auditory input can be accessed. So this is the process of lexical access. So once you've converted what you were hearing into this phonological code and you have searched for a matching phonological code from your mental lexicon, both of these things will be compared. That will be lexical access. Obviously, when you're doing this comparison, a perfect match will be available, but there might be some partial matches also. So all of those words will be activated as well. Now, basically, because you want to repeat back the same thing, you want to select something that is best, that is the best match out of the several activated alternatives. This again selection of the best match is referred to as the process of lexical selection. The selected word includes, now once you've selected this particular word and you've accessed this entry from the mental lexicon, this entry in the mental lexicon will include both grammatical information and semantic information stored in the mental lexicon. This information helps to determine how the word can be used in a given language. Okay, so finally, once you've activated all of this and you've basically you've used this particular word, now what you have to do is basically you have to access the meaning of the word. At the level of lexical access, we are generally only talking about the word form activation. When you're hearing the word, it is the phonological form activation. When you're reading the word, it is the visual form activation. Now, once you've done the lexical access and lexical selection, and you've accessed the information about what the word form is about, what are its syntactical aspects, some sense of semantic aspects as well, what you then do is you basically activate the word's full meaning, which is basically the lexical and semantic information. And this accessing the word's full meaning will result in the activation of the conceptual information. Now, the process of reading words is slightly different. In the process of reading words, only the last two steps of the linguistic analysis uh, is basically, will be common. Basically, the lexical access and activating the meaning part. The initial steps will be different because we are talking about a different modality altogether. Okay, So in reading, what actually happens is that the perceptual analysis will require the reader to identify the orthographic units, that is the script, that is the visual form from the visual input. Then these orthographic units may be mapped on uh, to orthographic word forms or translated into phonological units. So what you can do is, in reading there is an extra step, because you have to go from the visual to the phonological code and then again follow the same series of steps that we talked about in the auditory word form comprehension. Okay, so in reading, what you first do is you do the perceptual analysis. This perceptual analysis basically requires the reader to identify the orthographic units from the visual input. Suppose you're reading a word caterpillar, so you have to identify CATERPILLAR. Basically, once you have identified this, you're going to look for a similar matching visual form from your mental lexicon. Once you have basically activated both of these words, then what you can do is, or say for example, even before that, once you have, as soon as you activated the visual part, you will need to convert that visual part into a phonological part, because access to mental lexicon is from sound units. Okay, so these orthographic units may be mapped onto orthographic word forms, or alternatively, you can translate them into phonological units, which will activate a phonological word form in the mental lexicon, as in auditory comprehension. So either you can directly go from the visual form, pick out a visual entity from the mental lexicon and proceed further, or you go from visual form to phonological form and then you access the mental lexicon. That is basically what is happening. Now let's talk a little bit about understanding speech in a little bit more detail. Now, a listener of speech is confronted with a variety of sounds in their environment and needs to identify and discriminate first the relevant speech signals from other kinds of noise. So our environment is filled with so many different sounds. There is there are sounds of animals, there are sounds of living things, motor sounds, fan sounds, moving of furniture sound. There are so many sounds. If you're having a conversation in such kind of a busy environment, the first thing that you as a system will have to do is will have to distinguish the relevant speech sound. Let us say somebody is telling you something, you have to distinguish the relevant speech sound from all other kinds of noise. Now, one of the most important units here is the phoneme. Now, phonemes are the smallest units of sound that actually make a difference to meaning, and their number varies across different languages. See, for example, as I told you also probably in the last class, that English has around 40 phonemes, whereas other languages may have different number of phonemes altogether. Now, perceiving phonemes is different for different speakers of different languages. Say, let me take an example. The L and the R sounds are different phonemes for speakers of English. That's why we have words like, say, for example, lion and rat, where L and R are very different. Say, for example, but these two sounds are represented by the same phonemes in Japanese language, and therefore a Japanese language speaker will basically store them as versions of the same phoneme. Infants, when they're born, have the perceptual ability to distinguish any possible phonemes during the first year of their life. So, first year of their life, children have this very broad, band of the different kinds of phonemes they can perceive and listen to. In some sense, you could say that this is an evolutionary gift which allows our system to be able to learn any language where we are born in. We are not really, say, for example, it is not determined that if you are born to English speaking parents, you would definitely only have the neural know how to learn English. Even if you are born of English speaking parents, but you were raised in a, let's say, a Tamil speaking background, you will be able to learn Tamil as well, because you're hearing that from your first ear. So during the first year of life, infants will have this perceptual ability to distinguish any possible phonemes that they encounter during the entire year. Cole and colleagues actually found that initially infants could distinguish between two phonemes presented to them, but what happens is gradually this ability sort of fades out. So, gradually during the course of the first year, their perceptual sensitivities become more tuned, more accustomed, more adapted to perceive the phonemes of their native language only, and this generic ability of being able to perceive and separate phonemes kind of fades away. Let's take an example. So, Japanese infants at birth will be able to treat L and R as one phoneme, whereas English speaking infants will learn to treat L and R as two different phonemes. Okay. Now the babbling and the crying sounds that infants articulate, or that sounds that the infants make during the ages between 6 to 12 months, grow more and more similar to the phonemes that they are hearing in their language. So what is happening is that the production system is practicing, creating these sounds, and what happens is the sounds that they kind of make in the beginning gradually start to resemble the sound systems in the infants' native languages. Now, by the time infants would reach 1 year of age, they are no longer able to produce or perceive non-native phonemes. So, after 1 year of age, a Japanese child will not be able to perceive L and R as separate phonemes. They will basically be able to treat them only as one phoneme. Similarly, children will not be able to produce phonemes or even perceive phonemes from other language groups which do not belong to them. Yeah, so that is one of the important ideas. Now, so that is about the variability of the signal. Also, within the same speaker, given different emotional states, we will basically be able to, we will basically be able to produce the sounds differently. Suppose when you are very excited, you produce sounds in a different manner versus when you are very calm and relaxed. When you are to impart good news, your sound will be different. When you are supposed to give relatively poor, bad news, your sound will be slightly different. Now, the fact that also one of the other challenges is co-articulation. We do not say pa, ba, ka, ta, all of these phonemes separately. We obviously co-articulate them along with the other sounds that we are producing that form part of words. So, for example, pa, u, and la, we don't say that separately. If you have to say the word pool, we combine the three sounds, we sort of blend them together, and then we speak a joint utterance. That makes it very difficult for listeners to actually be able to segment this. Okay, so in order to be able to segment these sounds from each other, that is a bit of a challenge. So somebody who's listening the language has some of these challenges to take care of. Now, one might ask whether individuals identify the spoken input, or say, for example, how would they identify the spoken input given the large amount of variability that is possible in the signal, and also the fact that there is this segmentation problem. Now, one of the important clues is prosodic information. Prosodic information basically is the fact that there is a variation between the rhythm and the pitch of speaker's voice. So what the listener does is the listener derives this information, prosodic information, from the speaker's rhythm and pitch, and basically uses that prosodic information to understand that whether there are pauses or whether these sounds are starting or ending at some point. Let's take an example. Say, for example, if I were to tell you the word nitrates, then you will be sure that I'm talking about a chemical called nitrate. However, it could also be possible that if I just give a pause, let us say I say like night rates, then maybe I'm talking about, let us say I'm probably talking about a hotel, and I'm talking about the night rates of that hotel. Okay, so just using these pause, or just using, say, for example, the rhythm of all of this, speak listeners can actually derive this very important information and be able to understand speech better. This speech rhythm comes from variation in the duration of words and the placement of pauses between them. So that's what I was explaining to you. Now, prosody is supposed to be an important and factor and is apparent in all spoken utterances, but it is perhaps the most clearly illustrated when a speaker asks a question or emphasizes something. Say, for example, where were you? Where? So the emphasis is on where. Or say, for example, did you eat this thing? So the way I'm saying this, I'm placing emphasis on the word eat. Okay, so the prosody is apparent in all spoken utterances, but it's most clearly visible when somebody is asking questions or is placing emphasis on something. Now, when a question is asked, a speaker raises the frequency, as I was saying, raises the frequency of the voice towards the end of the question, And when emphasizing a part of speech, speakers typically raises the loudness and includes a pause after the critical part of the sentence. So these are just examples of how people do variations. These might not be universally applied across all speakers and all languages, but I hope you get the idea that the way we speak, the pauses we take, the rhythm changes that we do actually act as a very important clue for listeners to understand whatever we are speaking. Now, Anne Cutler and colleagues from the Max Planck Institute of Psycholinguistics at Netherlands have actually shown that English listeners use syllables that can carry accent or to establish word boundaries. For example, in a word like lettuce, the stress is on the first syllables. Lettuce has two syllables. Let has more stress. Us has less stress. So this is basically what is referred to as a trochaic words. And most words in English, approximately anywhere between 60 to 75% of the words, are trochaic words. Okay, and typically what happens is when you do this, it is usually heard as a single word. On the other hand, if you have a word like invests, or you see that the stress has shifted onto the next syllable, and basically sometimes what happens is this can cause the word invests to be heard as two words and not as a single word. Okay, so these are these minute and variations in the stress patterns which speakers utilize to understand what basically is being said. Let us delve a little bit more in detail. Heschel's gyri that are located on the supratemporal plane, superior and medial to the STG, that is the superior temporal gyrus, in each hemisphere actually contain the primary auditory cortex, and this is the part of the brain that processes incoming auditory input first. The areas surrounding the Heschel's gyri extend into the superior temporal sulcus are together known as the auditory association cortices. So auditory association cortices do the further processing. Now, neuroimaging studies in normal participants have shown that the Heschel's gyri of both the hemispheres are actually activated by speech and non-speech sounds in a similar manner, but that the activation of the superior temporal sulcus in both the hemispheres is modulated by whether the incoming auditory signal is a speech sound or it is not. Okay, so it is probably where some of the differentiation between speech and non-speech sounds is being made. Now, moving away from the Heschel's gyri, the areas of the brain that become slightly less sensitive to changes in non-speech sounds but more sensitive to changes in speech sounds. As you go further up from the brain, what you see is that the specialization for being distinguishing non-speech sound reduces because they are obviously less important to us as opposed to the sensitivity to speech sounds, because we need to understand them in much more detail. So, the posterior portions of the superior temporal sulcus of both the hemispheres, although mainly majorly on the left hemisphere, they seem especially involved in the processing of phonological information. Karl Wernick had actually found through his investigations that patients who have lesions in the left temporoparietal region, including the superior temporal gyrus, had difficulty in understanding spoken and written language. However, the lesions were not limited to the superior temporal gyrus, as we discussed earlier, they spread out to other surrounding cortical regions as well. One important study that contributes to a slightly better understanding was conducted by Binder and colleagues. Okay, and basically what happened was that participants in this study were made to listen to different types of sound, so speech sounds as well as non-speech sounds. The sounds presented were of different kinds, so white noise with systematic frequency or amplitude modulations, tones which were frequency modulated between the 50 Hz and 2400 Hz, reversed speech which was composed of real words just played backwards. Pseudo words were also there, which were actually pronounceable strings that contain the same letters as the real word. Say, for example, sked for desk. Now, the results of the study indicated that relative to noise, frequency modulated tones activated the posterior portions of the superior temporal gyrus in both the hemispheres. Areas found more sensitive to the speech sounds than to tones were more in the ventrolateral part, in or near the superior temporal sulcus, and they were lateralized mainly to the left hemisphere. So it seems that the left hemisphere it has some specialist abilities which it utilizes in analyzing heard speech. Now, Binder and colleagues' study also demonstrated that these areas are not involved in lexicosemantic processing of words. So they are not really concerned with meaning, but basically word form analysis. Okay, because they are equally activated for words, pseudo words, and reversed speech. All these three kinds of stimuli have characteristics of human speech, but they are not they are different from each other in terms of meaning. Say, for example, only the words will have meaning, pseudo words don't have meaning, and reverse speech basically sounds like gibberish. Now, based on the fMRI findings, Binder and colleagues actually proposed a hierarchical model of word recognition. Okay, so according to their model, what happens is that processing proceeds anteriorly from the superior temporal gyrus. First, the stream of auditory information proceeds from the auditory cortex in the Heschel's gyri to the superior temporal gyrus. Here, no distinction is made between speech and non-speech sounds. Then the first region of the brain where the distinction is made is around the mid region of the superior temporal sulcus, but again here there is no lexical semantic processing. Neurophysiological studies have indicated that recognizing whether a speech sound is a word or a non-word happens in around the first 50 to 80 milliseconds of time. Now, processing of this kind is mainly lateralized to the left hemisphere, where the combinations of different features of these sounds are analyzed so that you can make sense of okay, these sounds are present, whether they can be combined together to make a meaningful word or not. From the superior temporal sulcus onwards, the information proceeds to the final stage of word recognition in the middle temporal gyrus and in the inferior temporal gyrus, and finally it moves to the angular gyrus, which is posterior to the temporal areas and in slightly more anterior areas of the temporal pole. A review of at least 100 studies by DeWitt and Roshecker confirmed the findings that the left mid to anterior superior temporal gyrus responds preferentially to phonetic sounds of speech. So it is established that this is the reason this is the region which is more involved in processing of human speech sounds. Now, more recent fMRI studies by Blumstein and colleagues suggest that there is a network of areas involved in phonological processing during speech perception and production, including the left posterior superior temporal gyrus, the supramarginal gyrus, the inferior frontal gyrus, and the precentral gyrus. And the job for each of these are slightly distributed. So they say that left posterior superior temporal gyrus is involved in activation of sounds. Supramarginal gyrus is involved in the selection of correct sounds. Inferior frontal is basically involved in phonological planning, and the precentral gyrus is basically there for implementing general motor plans for production. Now we've talked a little bit in detail about understanding spoken speech. Let's talk a little bit about written input. Now, reading basically, as I said, involves perception and production of written language. To understand written input, basically, readers need to first recognize a visual pattern which our brains are peculiarly good at. Now, learning to read requires linking arbitrary visual symbols to meaningful words. Say, for example, whatever script you might be writing, per se, if you did not know the sounds of them and you did not know that they can be combined to create words, they will be just arbitrary. So the learning to read basically requires linking these arbitrary visual symbols from our scripts to meaningful words. And these visual symbols obviously vary a lot across different kinds of scripts, different kinds of writing systems. So for example, the way the writing system in English works is very different from the way writing system in Hindi works, or say for that matter in Japanese, Chinese, or French. So words need to be symbolized in writing in three different ways. There are alphabetic ways, alphabetic scripts, there are syllabic scripts, and there are logographic scripts. For example, most of these Western scripts of European languages are alphabetic. Japanese is syllabic, whereas Chinese is logographic. Okay. Now, however, we can talk about this in some detail moving further, but basically it's not really necessary because irrespective of the specific writing system, readers will basically need to analyze the primitive features of each of the script. How are different aspects, say for example, how is a curved line and straight line joined to form the alphabet that represents P, and if you add a slanted line under the curved line, then it becomes R, and so on. So basically, to be able to read, irrespective of the writing system involved, the readers will need to analyze the primitive features or the shapes of these symbols. So horizontal, vertical, and curved lines, and all of these elementary features that you're talking about. To understand this process better, how do we go from features to letters to words eventually? A model was put forward by Oliver Selfridge some time back, who postulated that a collection of small components combined together could allow the machines to recognize the patterns. Now, these small components, or daemons as Selfridge referred to them, would record basically events as they occur, and they would recognize the patterns in those events. Say, for example, when I'm reading, how many times I came across a curved line, uh, a horizontal line, or a vertical line, or a slanted line. Now, in Selfridge's model, which is known as the pandemonium model, the sensory input is temporarily stored as an iconic memory by the so called image daemons. Then there are 28 feature daemons which are each sensitive to a particular feature. Like one daemon can be dedicated to processing straight lines, the other daemon can be dedicated to processing curves, the other daemon can be dedicated to processing slanted lines. There might be a daemon that looks for whole circles, etc. All of these things basically need to be coded, actually decoded from the iconic representation of the sensory input. So when you're reading something, there are these feature daemons that are encoding each of these or decoding each of these single features. In the next step, what will happen is that all the representations of letters with these features will be activated by what are referred to as the cognitive daemons. Finally, the representation that best matches the input is selected by the decision daemon, which is basically what it is doing is it is picking up a representation from the mental lexicon and it is matching with the representation that is present in the input. Again, just matching it and basically saying, okay, this is the word that I am reading. And so I have stored the sound of it and I have stored the meaning of it and I know this word. Okay. Now, in the pandemonium model, there has been a lot of criticism because it is strictly a bottom up model, which basically starts from the features and then goes towards the decision process. Now, because this model does not really allow for things like feedback, it is less equipped to describe or explain findings like the word superiority effect. Okay, the idea is the word superiority effect is basically that humans are better at processing letters found in words than letters that are presented in nonsense letter strings or even in isolation. This is basically, I think, one of the experiments I probably talked about earlier was done by Riker, wherein he asks people to remember letters or strings of letters or basically match them to some kind of test input. And he found out that people were best at doing this task when the letters were presented as embedded in parts of words. So, for example, you have to recognize the word, the letter O and letter K. I will remember it better if it is presented in a word thing like fork or frock for that matter, versus if it were just presented by itself or embedded in a line of X's. In 1981, McClellan and Rumelhart, going just further, in 1981, McClellan and Rumelhart put forward a computational model that has been important for visual letter recognition. Okay, so in this model, basically there are again three levels of representations: a letter level, you know, a feature level, a letter level, and a word level. Okay, so there's a bit of a typo in this slide. The first is a layer for the features of letters, then there is a layer for letters, and then there is a layer for words. Now, an important feature of this model is that it allows for the top-down influence of information from the higher cognitive levels to influence earlier processes that happen at lower levels of representation. Now, this model is in contrast to that of Selfridge's model as it allows both top-down and bottom-up flow of information, whereas the latter is only allowed bottom-up flow of information. So this, McClelland's model, which is a parallel processing model, basically did not really allow. It basically allows both bottom-up and top-down flow of information, whereas Selfridge's model is a strictly bottom-up model. Another difference between these two models is that in the former, that is the Selfridge's model, processing can take in McClelland's model, processing can take place in parallel, such that several letters can be processed at the same time. Whereas in the Selfridge's model, only one letter is processed at one time in a serial sort of a manner. Now, the empirical validity of a model can only be tested based on real life phenomena or physiological phenomena or behavioral data, as you already know. So, if you compare these two models, you will find that the McClelland and Rumelhart's connectionist model actually does it does an excellent job of mimicking the reality for the word superiority effect. The word superiority effect basically again can be explained better in terms of the McClelland and Rumelhart model because the model proposes that top-down information of the words can either activate or inhibit letter activations thereby helping the recognition of letters. So the idea is that McClelland and Rumelhart's model basically does a good job of explaining the word superiority effect. They say that once the letters are being picked up, they kind of the activation is sent at the word level, and from the word level there is more feedback, which helps us remember these letters better. Whereas if you're reading letters in isolation, there is no feedback from the word level, and hence you will not be able to store or understand that much better. Let's talk a little bit about the neural substrates of visual word processing. Now, it has been known for some time that lesions in the occipitotemporal area, specifically in the left hemisphere, can give rise to alexia. Alexia is a disorder in which patients cannot read words, although other aspects of language are preserved. In early PET studies, Peterson and colleagues contrasted words with non-words and found that regions of the occipital cortex were there are that preferred reading word strings. So there are regions in the occipital cortex that only light up or activate when word strings are being read. This area was referred to as the visual word form area, a specialized area that processes script. Now, later studies using fMRI with normal participants, which were performed by Gregory McCarthy and colleagues, basically contrasted activation in response to letters with activation in response to faces and other visual textures. It was found that regions of the occipitotemporal cortex were actually activated preferentially in response to unpronounceable strings as opposed to visual textures or faces. Now, in a combined ERP and fMRI study that included healthy persons and patients with callosal lesions, Dehan and Cohen-Dehan and colleagues investigated the visual word form area. What did they find? In their study, as the participants focus on a fixation cross, a word or a non-word was flashed either to the right or the left visual field. Non-words were constant strings, basically incompatible with French orthographic principle, which were impossible to translate through phonology. Now, non-words are typically just assemblage of strings of letters which are not pronounceable and will typically not have any meaning. Now, when words were flashed on the screen, they were to repeat it out loud, and if a non-word were flashed, they have to say, think rien. Rien basically means nothing. The ERP indicated that the initial processing was restricted to early visual areas that were contralateral to the stimulated visual field. Further, activations actually revealed a common processing stage associated with the activation of a precise, reproducible site in the left occipitotemporal sulcus, a part of the visual word form area which coincides with the lesion site and, and basically causes pure alexia. Now, later studies have actually shown that this activation was visually elicited only for pre-lexical forms, but is basically invariant for the location of the stimulus or the case of the stimulus. So, wherever in the left visual field or the right visual field, or in small case or in upper case. So finally, researchers were able to find out that processing beyond this point was the same for all kinds of word stimuli from either visual field, a result that corresponds to the standard model of word reading. Remember, we are talking about that once you've done the lexical access, once you've done the lexical selection, the modality specificity goes. Then it is basically for all kinds of words. What you will do is you will access the word form, activate the the form of the word phonological or otherwise, and you activate the meaning, and then integration and other processes take place. So in this lecture we talked about language comprehension, basically the initial stages of both spoken language and of written language. Thank you.